doubts that. And that can explain a lot, indeed, about attachment and so forth. So something about our developmental wiring and the algorithms that these neural circuits run tend to bias most people, the non-practice meditators, to live a somewhat functional life, at least, without this awareness of actor and observer.
Right.
And so what you're really talking about is a deliberate intervention to understand and resolve that gap in the algorithm. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
I'm more or less restating what you said in a way that I'm hoping will serve as a jumping off point as to, why questions are always very dangerous in biology or any,
Or in relationship. Yeah.
What's that?
Or in relationship.
Or in relationship, right, exactly. Although I think it all does really come back to this early developmental wiring, which of course is modifiable. That's the beauty of the nervous system, is it's the one organ that seems to be able to change itself, at least to some degree.
Right.
So what are your thoughts about the organization of the circuitry to essentially, under normal conditions, to not reveal what seems to be one of its more important and profound and, dare I say, enlightening features? Right? It's almost as if we are potentially like mantis shrimp. We can see so many more colors than we actually see, and yet we don't. We sort of most people opt not to. And I would argue that one of the great strengths of the Waking Up app, for instance, is that it essentially walks you through the process of being able to arrive at these things without having to go do 1 year or 3 year long silent meditation retreats.
Yeah.
So if you could just elaborate for a moment before we move on about, what are your thoughts about how the circuitry is arranged by default versus and what that means for there to be an intervention, that we have to intervene in the self in order to reveal the self?
Well, so the two big questions there, one about evolution, one about development. So with respect to evolution, I mean, it's important to recognize that evolution doesn't see our deepest concerns about human flourishing and human well-being.
It's all about the opposite.
It's just, we are set up to spawn and to survive long enough to help our progeny spawn if we can do that, and that's it, right? And so anything that was good for that, including, tribalism and xenophobia and, all kinds of hardware and software flaws that are reveal themselves to be flaws in the present time when we're trying to build a viable global civilization. But they redounded to the advantage of our ancestors somehow, or there are things about us that we're simply not selected for. They just kind of came along for the ride. What Stephen Jay Gould called it, a spandrel. We are not set up by evolution to be as happy as we possibly can be, and certainly, and to do almost anything that interests us well. I mean, we're not set up by evolution to be mathematicians or musicians or to create democracies that are healthy. I mean, evolution can see none of this, and we're doing these things based on cognitive and emotional hardware that we're leveraging in new directions, right? I mean, we are primates, and we're communicating with small mouth noises. I mean, we're language using primates, and all of that is clearly evolved. And we're doing these amazing things, including science. However improbably, we're actually able to almost entirely with language, understand reality that at a scale that exceeds us in both directions. I mean, the very vast and the very small, and also temporally, very old. We have visions of the far future. We can figure out where an asteroid is going to cross Earth's orbit 1,000 years from now, if we just do the math. And it's amazing that we can do all of those things, but evolution is blind to all of that, right? And so we have, in terms of what we care about, and certainly in terms of what's going to ensure our survival as a species, we have flown the perch that was created for us by evolution. It's not just the primate things. And so it is with learning how to regulate our emotions and punch through to a self-concept or beyond a self-concept. that is more normative psychologically, that allows us to, not be terrorized by our apish genes as fully as we seem to be, even in the presence of more and more destructive technology. I mean, we're still practically chimpanzees armed with nuclear weapons, right? I mean, and that is, increasingly dysfunctional. And very soon we're going to be in the presence of minds or apparent minds that we have built, that are as intelligent as we are, and very quickly, probably 15 minutes after that, far more intelligent than we are. And so what we do with all of that is, again, something that we have to figure out based on the minds we have, the minds we can build, the minds we can change. We can meddle with our own genomes now, and that will produce its own consequences. In ourselves and in future generations if we meddle with the germline. And again, all of that is just, evolution is just sort of the womb we came out of, but it didn't anticipate any of that, right? So that, Mother Nature has simply not had our best interests at heart, right? And we might die off, and from the point of view of Mother Nature, that's fine, because 99% of every species dies off, So there's that. But when you're talking about the individual developmentally, so we all come into this world again as a fairly hairless primate that needs a tremendous amount of care by others, and the logic of that is that the reason why we're not a gazelle that can run 45 minutes later and then basically do all the gazelle things perfectly soon thereafter. The reason why we have this time of immaturity, and that has become functional for us, is that it's just we're far more flexible. We can learn based on the needs of an environment to do so much more than a gazelle can, and language is part of that. And in the last 10,000 years or so, culture increasingly has been more and more a part of that. And there's probably a layer at which we can plausibly talk about cultural evolution, and cultural evolution interacting with biological evolution to change us. But when you're talking about the development of an individual, each of us comes into this world, I think, not recognizing ourselves in any sense that it would make sense to reify. It's not that there's nothing there. There could be some kind of proto-self differentiation, but I think it takes a long while, and there is very likely a coincidence between really recognizing others. We recognize others first, and we're certainly in relationship immediately, and we orient to human faces, and we even detect other humans as good and bad moral actors very early. Certainly long before we recognize ourselves in a mirror. There are experiments run, again, this is Paul Bloom and colleagues, experiments run on kind of the moral hardware and software of developing toddlers. But I think at this point they push it down all the way to like 6 months of age, where you'll get these infants staring at kind of a puppet show, and they'll show a greater interest in classically good actors versus bad actors, cooperators versus defectors in various puppet show games. So it's not that we have no mind and no proto-awareness of others and of self, but what eventually happens, certainly as we become at all facile with language use, is that we become aware that not only are we in relationship to others, but we are an object in the world for them, right? So that we have enough people pointing at us in our cribs, right, and impinging upon our experience, right? You're being physically moved and prodded and touched and consoled or not consoled. And just imagine what all of these, you're on the receiving end of 10,000 interventions, right? And you're completely helpless for the longest time. And all of that attention, you have all of these people coming up, to the crib and making faces at you,
cheering,
and it's all pointed at you, right? So there's there's a classic magical narcissism that gets constructed there. If you take the psychological literature, or, at least a certain strand of it seriously, and I think it's largely apt to think of a child at that age as a kind of there's a kind of narcissistic structure there where it's all kind of going inward, and at a certain point you realize, okay, I'm the center of all of this, right? Like it's not just a movie that you're where you're completely absorbed in, and you've lost your sense of self. I mean, this is yet another example of what it's like as a grown-up to lose our sense of self. And one of the things I think we find so fascinating about television and film is that when we get totally absorbed in it, we're in this very unusual circumstance where our brain is basically reading it as we're in the classic social circumstance. We're presented with the facial displays of other people. In fact, we can get sometimes these people are 10 feet tall, right? Or their faces are 10 feet tall. You have a close up in a movie theater. So it's like this super stimulus in terms of evolution. And they could be making direct eye contact with the camera, right? So you have this gigantic face staring at you, and yet you're totally unimplicated socially. You can't be seen, and something about you you can't be seen, and so you completely lose self-consciousness, and yet you're able to examine with completely free attention, again, because you're totally unimplicated. The facial minutia and the mimetic facial play of people from at a very close range. I mean, you're seeing people close. I mean, you'd have to be, physically just about to kiss your spouse. Like that's what a close-up is in a film, right? Like that, you never get that close to people, right? And yet here you're in a situation where you're unobserved, and you know that. And so, it's a bit of a tangent, but it's the other side of what's happening developmentally for a kid. When you're in a movie theater watching a movie, you are truly invisible, and yet you're right there seeing, however harrowing the human drama is, you're seeing it play out, and you're seeing it up close, and it is in principle a social encounter that your genes are ready for, but they're not ready for you to be invisible, right? And so that's what's so magical about it. But what happens developmentally for a kid is that you're not invisible. You are an object that is constantly being overrun. The boundaries of your sensory engagement with the world are constantly being impinged upon by others. And at a certain point, you recognize, okay, I'm at the center of this, and the way this gets enshrined as a self, I think is probably coincident with our learning the language game we learn to play with others. We're talking to others, people are talking to us, and at a certain point, we're talking to ourselves even when the other people leave the room, right? So, and you can hear it if you ever have been with a toddler when they're externalizing their self-talk. You hear them talking to themselves. They're playing and they're having a conversation. They were talking to you, the parent, but then you left the room and they're still talking. You come back in and they're still talking, right? And what happens to us, strangely, and this comes back to the logic of evolution, we never stop because evolution never thought to build us an off switch for this, right? I mean, language is so useful, and it gets tuned up so strongly for us. And there was never a reason to shut it off, right? There was never a reason to give you this ability to say, wouldn't it be nice to have 4 hours of quiet now, and like no self-talk? And so for most of us, I mean, I think there are people who, for whatever neurological reason or, idiosyncratic reason, undoubtedly there'd be a neurological reason for it, don't have any self-talk. But for most of us, we are covertly talking basically all the time. And there's an imagistic component of this for many people. You're visualizing things as well, but there's just a ton of white noise in the mind that feels a certain way. And what you discover in meditation ultimately is that the self is what it feels like to be thinking without knowing that you're thinking. Right? A thought arises uninspected and seems to just become you. Right? So like you and I are talking now, and people are listening to us. They're struggling to follow the train of this conversation because it is competing with the conversation that's happening in their heads. Right? So I'll be saying something, and a person listening will say, "Well, what does that mean?" Or like, "Oh, but wait a minute, he just contradicted himself." Or like, and there's a voice in your head that is also vying for your attention much of the time. And so it's the first discovery people make in meditation is that it's just so hard to pay attention to anything, the breath or a mantra or a sound, whatever it is, because you're thinking. You're thinking about the thing you need to do in an hour, and it's so good that I downloaded this app. I'm like, this is really good. This is going to be good for me. And that chatter isn't showing up. You're not far back enough in the theater of consciousness, so as to see it emerge. It is just sneaking up behind you, and it feels like me again. It feels like when someone is thinking the thought, well, what the hell does that mean, right? They're not seeing it as an emerging object in consciousness. It just feels like me. It just feels subjectively, it's like the mind contracts around this appearance in consciousness, and it is just a sound with the voice of the mind. If you actually can inspect it, it is deeply inscrutable that we ever feel identified with our thoughts. I mean, how is it that we could be a thought? These thoughts, a thought just arises and passes away, and when you inspect it, when you go to inspect it, it unravels. It's the least substantial possible thing, and it could be a thought of self-hatred. It could be a thought that unrecognized totally defines your mood. It's like. Just again, this all can seem kind of abstract, but
well, no, but I think it's extremely concrete from the perspective of the neural circuits that we'll return to maybe in a few minutes. I'd like to take a brief break and thank our sponsor, Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker is a personalized nutrition platform that analyzes data from your blood and DNA to help you better understand your body and help you reach your health goals. I've long been a believer in getting regular blood work done for the simple reason that many of the factors that impact your immediate and long-term health can only be analyzed from a quality blood test. The problem with a lot of blood and DNA tests out there, however, is that you get data back about metabolic factors, lipids, and hormones, and so forth, but you don't know what to do with those data. Inside Tracker solves that problem and makes it very easy for you to understand what sorts of nutritional, behavioral, maybe even supplementation-based interventions you might want to take on in order to adjust the numbers of those metabolic factors, hormones, lipids, and other things that impact your immediate and long-term health to bring those numbers into the ranges that are appropriate and indeed optimal for you. If you'd like to try Inside Tracker, you can visit insidetracker.com/Huberman and get 20% off any of Inside Tracker's plans. That's insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 20% off. If you could elaborate a bit on this notion of internal chatter and external stimuli and the bridge between them, because I think that for some people that might be intuitive. I think for others, it's not so obvious that language is ongoing in the backdrop.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I think some people are more tuned into that language. For some people, it's louder volume. For some people, it's more structured. I have a colleague at Stanford who's been on this podcast called Diceroff. He's like bioengineer. He's also a psychiatrist, and he doesn't call it a meditative practice. He has a practice where each evening after his 5 kids are put down to sleep, they're older now, but and in the quiet of the late hours of the night, early morning, he sits and forces himself to think in complete sentences with punctuation for an hour. This is the way that he has taught himself to structure his thinking, because of the very fact that you're describing, which is that ordinarily there is an underlying structure to what's internal, but it's disrupted by external events, and these are typically it's not coherent enough to really make meaning from it. So it's almost like somebody sitting down to write in complete sentences, but forcing himself to do it in his head. But for many people, including myself, that's a foreign experience, and we only experience structure through our interactions with the world and other people. That I've taken the time to try and explore ideas with eyes closed, and I've been able to do that. There are certain pharmacologic states that we could talk about that facilitate that, and no, those are not amphetamines. Those do exactly the opposite, by the way. But I think people exist in varying degrees of structured and unstructured internal dialogue, and in varying depths of recognition of that internal dialogue. And so the question, I suppose, is just the recognition that there's a dialogue ongoing internally, is that itself valuable?
Yeah, and that also can take some time. So here's a claim I would make that some people might find surprising, but I think this is an objectively true claim about the subjectivity of most people, which is that unless you have a fair amount of training, unless you just happen to be some kind of savant in this area, which most people by definition aren't, or you have a remarkable amount of training in what's called concentration practice in meditation. I believe this is a true claim that if we just put a stopwatch on this table and people could just watch it, 30 seconds elapse, and I set all of our listeners or your viewers the task for the next 30 seconds. Just pay attention to anything, your breath, or the sight of your hand or the sight of the clock or any object, without getting lost in thought, without getting momentarily distracted by this conversation you're having with yourself. This couple things would happen. One is no one would be able to do it, right? And not just, this is not just a superficial inability. I mean, if your life depended on it, you wouldn't be able to do it. I mean, if the fate of civilization depended on it, none of our listeners would be able to do this. And yet some percentage of them are so distracted by thought that they would think that they will actually try this experiment and think they succeeded, right? And for these people, what happens is you put them on a meditation retreat and you have them spend 12 hours a day in silence doing nothing but this, right? So the practice is just pay attention to the breath when they're sitting, and then eventually you incorporate everything, sounds and other sensations. And then you interleave that with walking meditation where they're paying attention just to the sensations of lifting and moving and placing their feet. And then, once the practice is going, you incorporate sounds and sights and everything. So you can pay attention to everything, but the goal is for every moment, you are going to cultivate this faculty of mind, which increasingly is known as mindfulness, right? So, and mindfulness is nothing other than this very careful attention to the contents of consciousness. But the crucial piece is, it is not a moment of being lost in thought, right? You're not blocking thoughts. Thoughts themselves can arise, but in those moments of being truly mindful, you're noticing thoughts as thoughts, whether it's language in the mind or images. You're noticing those too as spontaneous appearances in consciousness. If most people, certainly anyone who thinks they can pay attention to, they can do the experiment successfully that I just suggested, pay attention to something for 30 seconds without being lost in thought. You put those people on a meditation retreat, what they're going to experience is, on the first day, they're going to feel like, oh yeah, I was with the breath, or I was walking, I was with the sensations of walking, and I'd be there for like 5 minutes, solid, and then I would get lost in thought, and I'd come back, and 5 more minutes, I'd get lost in thought, and I'd get back. But as the days progressed, even 10 days into a silent meditation retreat, they're going to experience more and more distraction. It's going to seem like, okay, wait a minute. Now I can't pay attention to anything for more than 5 seconds, right? That is progress, right? Because what they're discovering is just how distractible they are, right? And, so for some people that will be immediately obvious. For some people, it'll actually take a lot of practice to realize just how distracted they are.
What you just said, which was that at some point, we can start noticing our thoughts. I can notice my thoughts, but what you're talking about is, as a goal state, is not being distracted by thoughts, but actually seeing the relationship between thoughts, self, and other types of perceptions. And here, I think recognizing and seeing thoughts is a form of perception. It's just an internally directed perception. This raises a topic that I'm also obsessed by, which I think neuroscience can somewhat explain, but still incompletely, that the circuits and mechanics, et cetera, are not yet known, which is about time perception. And, a simple analogy would be that there are a lot of small objects flying around in the space that we happen to be having this discussion, but they're moving so fast that I can't perceive them. Or they're entirely stationary, so I can't perceive them because of the reasons we talked about before in the visual system. My eyes are moving in perfect concert with these small object movements, and therefore I am blind to them.
Right.
A slight shift in time perception. Think of this perhaps as a change in the frame rate. Camera frame rates, faster frame rate, you can capture slow motion. Slower frame rate, you're going to get more of a strobe type effect if the frame rate is low enough. Right? Could it be that our time perception is not one thing, but we have one rate of perceiving time for external objects at a given distance, which we know is true. Another frame rate for objects that are up close. We know this to be true even if those objects are moving at the exact same speed, right? I mean, this would be the sitting on a train, the rungs on the fence seem to be going by very, very fast, but the ones in the distance seem to be moving slowly. Right. This is the way the visual system and time perception interconnect at some level. You're up on a skyscraper, the little ants of cars and people down below, they're moving much faster than you perceive them to move. Yeah. But it's a distance effect.
I mean, you see a plane, it's going to be going 300 miles an hour.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not because of the lack of resolution. The lack of resolution is incidental. We know this because in animals such as hawks that have twice the degree of acuity, as far as we know, they have the same distance-associated shifts in time perception. So could it be that we are running multiple streams of time perception, multiple cones of attention that include cones of attention to our thoughts, and that somehow through meditation we start to align the frame rate for these different streams of attention so that they all fall into the same movie, if you will, although it's not just a movie with visual content. What I'm doing here is clearly I'm becoming a lumper rather than a splitter. I'm sure this violates certain rules of time perception and neural circuitry, but I'm not sure that it's entirely untrue either. And does it survive at all as a possible model for what you're describing? And if the answer is no, I'm perfectly comfortable with that.
Well, it's dependent on what you mean by meditation. This is where you sort of the particularities of what one is doing with one's attention under the frame of meditation really matter, because there are ways to practice mindfulness in particular where the frame rate really does seem to go way, way up, right? And there's actually been some research done on this where you take people before and after a 3-month silent meditation retreat, and you give them some kind of visual discrimination task where they have to detect. I think they used a tachistoscope. Is that the tool for it? There's some that presents very quick pulses of light. And in any case, you can discriminate just in any sensory channel. I would imagine you can make finer grained discriminations if you're practicing mindfulness in a very specific way, which is to be making these fine-grained discriminations more and more, and do nothing else for 3 months, which is a way of practicing. So the classic mindfulness practice in what's called vipassana meditation is to pay scrupulous attention to seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching in a way that breaks everything down into this kind of microscopic sensory moments. So, you're, rather than feel your hands pressing together, what you're trying to feel with your attention, and you're feeling more and more, is all of the micro sensations of pressure and temperature and movement, such that the feeling of hands completely disappears. You realize that a hand is a concept, and all you have is this cloud of punctate and very brief sensations. And so anything you think you have as a datum of experience, as you bore into it with your attention, it resolves into this kind of diaphanous cloud of changing sensation, and that can be even something as captivating as like a serious pain in your body. And you have like you've injured your neck, and so you have some excruciating pain in your neck. If you just are willing to pay attention to it, and just pay 100% attention to it, a couple things happen. One is your resistance to feeling it goes away by definition, because now your goal is to just pay attention to it, and you recognize that so much of the suffering associated with the pain was born of the resistance to feeling it. You're kind of bracing against it, and all of your thinking about it. You think like, well, why did I do this to myself, or when should I see an orthopedist, or how long is this going to last, and you're, maybe I herniated a disc. Like all of that self-talk is producing anxiety, and I'm not saying there's never anything to think about there, but either you can do something about it in the moment or you can't. And so much of our suffering in the presence of pain is the result of resisting it, worrying about it. It's just everything we're doing with our minds, but just feeling it, right? So when you just feel it, again, it breaks apart into this ever-shifting collection of different sensations, and it's not one thing, and it never stays the same. And so there's two things happen there. One is there can be a tremendous amount of relief that happens there, where you can achieve a level of equanimity, even in the presence of really unpleasant, physical sensation. And this is true of mental sensation as well. So it's true of emotions. The classically negative emotions like anger, or depression, or fear. The moment you become willing to just feel them in all of their punctate and changeable qualities, they cease to be what they were a moment ago. When you're talking about emotional states, they cease to map back onto you and your self-concept as meaningful in the same way. So that suddenly, the anxiety you feel, let's say before going out on stage to give a talk, a moment ago it had psychological meaning. It felt like, I'm anxious. How do I get rid of this? Why am I this sort of person? Should I have taken a beta blocker? This is the conversation you're having with yourself. The moment you just become willing to feel it as the pure energy of the physiology of cortisol release, it ceases to have any meaning. It ceases to be a problem in that moment, because it no more maps onto the kind of person you are than a feeling of indigestion or pain in your knee maps onto the kind of person you are. It's just sensation. Anyway, back to the main point here, which is that if you train your attention in this way to notice the particularities of sensory experience and emotional experience, like you're looking for the atoms of experience, you get better and better at that, and certain things happen. But one thing that I really do think happens is there's a kind of frame rate change in the data stream, where you really you're just noticing much more. All of that is a very interesting way of training. It's not what I tend to recommend now. It's a great preliminary practice for what I do recommend, because it really teaches you the difference between being lost in thought and not. It really teaches you what mindfulness is, but it tends to be done, by 99.9% of people in a dualistic way, which you're set up to think, okay, I'm over here as the locus of attention, and I'm continually getting distracted by thought, and the project is to not do that anymore and actually pay attention to the breath and sounds and sensations, and every time I get lost in thought, I'm going to go back to here. But this whole dance of I'm lost in thought, now I'm strategically directing my attention again, all of this seems to ramify this sense of self, the sense of there's one to be doing this. There's somebody holding the spotlight of attention and getting better at coming back to the object of meditation. Again, it's inevitable that 99.9% of people are going to start there and stay there for some considerable period of time. But the thing I like to do when I talk about all of this is undercut the false assumptions that are anchoring all of that as early as possible. Because where I think you want to be is recognizing that there is no place from which to aim attention. Right? This whole dualistic setup of subject and object is the thing that is already not there. And it's not that it's there and you meditate it out of existence successfully. It's really not there. And if you learn how to look for it, you can see that it's not there and feel that it's not there, and it no longer seems to be there, right? It's like it's not, and it becomes like a bistable percept where you looked at it long enough and you thought, okay, now I see the vase and the face, and I can't unsee it, and every time I look, it's there again, right? And so yeah, I mean, so to come back to the example you gave with your colleague at Stanford, whose book I know I haven't read it. He wrote a book, Projections, right? Deseroth, yeah. So it's on my stack to read, but it's the opposite. What I'm recommending is essentially the opposite end of the continuum of the sort of internal exercise he was doing. So rather than, he's doing something very deliberate and controlled, and he is deliberately thinking in complete sentences and kind of commandeering the machinery of thought and attention in a way that I would imagine, I mean, I'd be interested to talk to him about it, but I would imagine he really feels like he's doing that, right? And there's
he's an engineer. It's as you describe it in this way, it reminds me he's a physician, but he's also an engineer. So it's really about taking the raw materials of thought and engineering something structured from it. I think. Right. I haven't been in Carl's mind.
But if we got him talking on that, I'm sure we would get a sense of what it is.
We'll do that conversation at some point. So it's the exact opposite of what you're describing.
The exact opposite would be to recognize that the sense of control is a total illusion, right? Because you don't know what you're going to think next, right? And even he, in the most laborious way, I mean, he could just get as muscular as he wants with it. He still doesn't know what he's going to think next, right? Because thoughts simply arise, right? Like, you can run this experiment for yourself, and this connects up to the topic of free will, which we might want to touch. But I mean, just think of any category of thing. If I asked you to think of, the names of cities, or of, friends you have, or of famous people you can, remember exist, or think of nouns, or anything, and just watch what comes percolating into consciousness. Right now, there are things you can't think of, right? There are things you don't know the name of. There are languages you don't speak. There are famous people you've never seen or never heard of, right? And so so you have no control over that part. Like those names and faces are not going to suddenly come streaming into consciousness. But of the totality of facts and figures and faces and names that you do know, right? Only some will come vying for inclusion, right? And they're not. And there's a sort of, we could make guess, and we know something about the neurology of this, but depending on what channel you're waiting for thoughts in, I mean, it's going to be different if it's visual or semantic or episodic memory. I mean, all of these things are different, but wherever you kind of point your inner gaze of attention and wait for the next face or name, certain things are going to come and certain things aren't going to come. And how you land on one, right? There'll be this process. If you're paying attention, you might think, let's say we go with names of cities, right? You'll think of Paris, you'll think of London, you'll think of Rome, you'll think of Sedona, you'll think these names